Chapter 1 of Grandma Knight's Tales. Briar Rose by the Grimm brothers, also known as the Brothers Grimm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Briar Rose. A king and queen once upon a time reigned in a country a great way off, where there were in those days fairies. Now this king and queen had plenty of money, and plenty of fine clothes to wear, and plenty of good things to eat and drink, and a coach to ride out in every day. But though they had been married many years, they had no children, and this grieved them very much indeed. But one day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, at the bottom of the garden, she saw a poor little fish that had thrown itself out of the water, and lay gasping and nearly dead on the bank. Then the queen took pity on the little fish, and threw it back again into the river, and before it swam away, it lifted its head out of the water, and said, "I know what your wish is, and it shall be fulfilled. In return for your kindness to me, you will soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a little girl, so very beautiful that the king could not cease looking on it for joy, and said he would hold a great feast and make merry, and show the child to all the land. So he asked his kinsmen and nobles and friends and neighbors. But the queen said, "I will have the fairies also, that they might be kind and good to our little daughter." Now there were 13 fairies in the kingdom, but as the king and queen had only 12 golden dishes for them to eat out of, they were forced to leave one of the fairies without asking her. So 12 fairies came, each with a high red cap on her head, and red shoes with high heels on her feet, and a long white wand in her hand. And after the feast was over, they gathered round in a ring and gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her goodness, another beauty, another riches, and so on, till she had all that was good in the world. Just as 11 of them had done blessing her, a great noise was heard in the courtyard, and word was brought that the 13th fairy was come, with a black cape on her head, and black shoes on her feet, and a broomstick in her hand, and presently up she came into the dining hall. Now, as she had not been asked to the feast, she was very angry, and scolded the king and queen very much, and set to work to take her revenge. So she cried out, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year be wounded by a spindle and fall down dead." Then the 12th of the friendly fairies, who had not yet given her gift, came forward, and said that the evil wish must be fulfilled, but that she could soften its mischief. So her gift was, that the king's daughter, when the spindle wounded her, should not really die, but should only fall asleep for 100 years. However, the king hoped still to save his dear child altogether from the threatened evil, so he ordered that all the spindles in the kingdom should be bought up and burnt. But all the gifts of the first 11 fairies were in the meantime fulfilled, for the princess was so beautiful and well behaved and good and wise that everyone who knew her loved her. It happened that on the very day she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and she was left alone in the palace. So she roved about by herself, and looked at all the rooms and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower, to which there was a narrow staircase ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it the door sprang open, and there sat an old lady spinning away very busily. "Why, how now, good mother?" said the princess. "What are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head, humming a tune, while buzz went the wheel. "How prettily that thing turns round," said the princess, and took the spindle and began to try and spin. But scarcely had she touched it before the fairy's prophecy was fulfilled. The spindle wounded her, and she fell down, lifeless, on the ground. However, she was not dead, but had only fallen into a deep sleep, and the king and queen, who had just come home, and all their court, fell asleep too. And the horses slept in the stables, and the dogs in the court, the pigeons on the housetop, and the very flies slept on the walls. Even the fire on the hearth left off blazing and went to sleep. The jack stopped, and the spit that was turning about with a goose upon it for the king's dinner stood still. And the cook, who was at that moment pulling the kitchen boy by the hair to give him a box on the ear for something he had done amiss, let him go, and both fell asleep. The butler, who was slyly tasting the ale, fell asleep with the jug at his lips, and thus everything stood still and slept soundly. A large hedge of thorns soon grew round the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker, till at last the old palace was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But there went a report through all the land of the beautiful sleeping Briar Rose, for so the king's daughter was called, so that, from time to time, several kings' sons came and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This, however, none of them could ever do, for the thorns and bushes laid hold of them, as it were with hands, and there they stuck fast and died wretchedly. After many, many years, there came a king's son into that land, and an old man told him the story of the thicket of thorns, and how a beautiful palace stood behind it, and how a wonderful princess called Briar Rose lay in it asleep with all her court. He told, too, how he had heard from his grandfather that many, many princes had come and tried to break through the thicket, but that they had all stuck fast in it and died. Then the young prince said, "All this shall not frighten me. I will go and see this Briar Rose." The old man tried to hinder him, but he was bent upon going. Now that very day the 100 years were ended, and as the prince came to the thicket, he saw nothing but beautiful flowering shrubs, through which he went with ease, and they shut in after him as thick as ever. Then he came at last to the palace, and there in the court lay the dogs asleep, and the horses were standing in the stables, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep, with their heads under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies were sleeping on the walls, the spit was standing still, the butler had the jug of ale at his lips, going to drink a draught, the maid sat with a fowl in her lap ready to be plucked, and the cook in the kitchen was still holding up her hand as if she was going to beat the boy. Then he went on still farther, and all was so still that he could hear every breath he drew, till at last he came to the old tower and opened the door of the little room in which Briar Rose was, and there she lay, fast asleep on a couch by the window. She looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her, so he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But the moment he kissed her, she opened her eyes and awoke, and smiled upon him. And they went out together, and soon the king and queen also awoke, and all the court, and gazed on each other with great wonder. And the horses shook themselves, and the dogs jumped up and barked, the pigeons took their heads from under their wings, and looked about and flew into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed again, the fire in the kitchen blazed up, round went the jack, and round went the spit, with the goose for the king's dinner upon it. The butler finished his draught of ale, the maid went on plucking the fowl, and the cook gave the boy the box on his ear. And then the prince and Briar Rose were married, and the wedding feast was given, and they lived happily together all their lives long. End of Briar Rose by the Brothers Grimm. This has been a LibriVox recording, recorded by Deborah Knight, October 23rd, 2013. Section 2 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Grandmother by Hans Christian Andersen. Grandmother is very old. Her face is wrinkled, and her hair is quite white. But her eyes are like two stars, and they have a mild, gentle expression in them when they look at you, which does you good. She wears a dress of heavy, rich silk, with large flowers worked on it, and it rustles when she moves. And then she can tell the most wonderful stories. Grandmother knows a great deal, for she was alive before father and mother, that's quite certain. She has a hymn book with large silver clasps, in which she often reads, and in the book, between the leaves, lies a rose, quite flat and dry. It is not so pretty as the roses which are standing in the glass, and yet she smiles at it most pleasantly, and tears even come into her eyes. I wonder why Grandmother looks at the withered flower in the old book that way. Do you know? Why, when Grandmother's tears fall upon the rose, and she is looking at it, the rose revives, and fills the room with its fragrance. The walls vanish as in a mist, and all around her is the glorious green wood, where in summer the sunlight streams through thick foliage, and Grandmother, why, she is young again, a charming maiden, fresh as a rose, with round, rosy cheeks, fair, bright ringlets, and a figure pretty and graceful. But the eyes, those mild, saintly eyes, are the same. They have been left to Grandmother. At her side sits a young man, tall and strong. He gives her a rose, and she smiles. Grandmother cannot smile like that now. Yes, she is smiling at the memory of that day, and many thoughts and recollections of the past. But the handsome young man is gone, and the rose has withered in the old book, and Grandmother is sitting there, again an old woman, looking down upon the withered rose in the book. Grandmother is dead now. She had been sitting in her armchair, telling us a long, beautiful tale, and when it was finished, she said she was tired, and leaned her head back to sleep a while. We could hear her gentle breathing as she slept. Gradually it became quieter and calmer, and on her countenance beamed happiness and peace. It was as if lighted up with a ray of sunshine. She smiled once more, and then people said she was dead. She was laid in a black coffin, looking mild and beautiful in the white folds of the shrouded linen, though her eyes were closed. But every wrinkle had vanished, her hair looked white and silvery, and around her mouth lingered a sweet smile. We did not feel at all afraid to look at the corpse of her who had been such a dear, good grandmother. The hymn book, in which the rose still lay, was placed under her head, for so she had wished it, and then they buried Grandmother. On the grave, close by the churchyard wall, they planted a rose tree. It was soon full of roses, and the nightingale sat among the flowers, and sang over the grave. From the organ in the church sounded the music and the words of the beautiful psalms which were written in the old book under the head of the dead one. The moon shone down upon the grave, but the dead was not there. Every child could go safely, even at night, and pluck a rose from the tree by the churchyard wall. The dead know more than we do who are living. They know what a terror would come upon us if such a strange thing were to happen as the appearance of a dead person among us. They are better off than we are. The dead return no more. The earth has been heaped on the coffin, and it is earth only that lies within it. The leaves of the hymn book are dust, and the rose, with all its recollections, has crumbled to dust also. But over the grave fresh roses bloom, the nightingale sings, and the organ sounds, and there still lives a remembrance of old grandmother, with the loving, gentle eyes that always looked young. Eyes can never die. Ours will once again behold dear grandmother, young and beautiful as when, for the first time, she kissed the fresh red rose that is now dust in the grave. End of Grandmother. Recording by Deborah Knight. October 24th, 2013. Section 3 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Little Tiny, or Thumbelina. There once was a woman who wished very much to have a child, but she could not obtain her wish. At last she went to a fairy and said, "I should so very much like to have a child. Can you tell me where I can find one?" "Oh, that can be easily managed," said the fairy. "Here is a barleycorn of a different kind to those which grow in the farmers' fields, at which the chickens eat. Put it into a flower pot and see what will happen." "Thank you," said the woman, and she gave the fairy 12 shillings, which was the price of the barleycorn. Then she went home and planted it, and immediately there grew up a large handsome flower, something like a tulip in appearance, but with its leaves tightly closed as if it were still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, and she kissed the red and golden colored leaves, and while she did so the flower opened, and she could see that it was a real tulip. Within the flower, upon the green velvet stamens, sat a very delicate and graceful little maiden. She was scarcely half as long as a thumb, and they gave her the name of Thumbelina, or Tiny, because she was so small. A walnut shell, elegantly polished, served her for a cradle. Her bed was formed of blue-violet leaves, with a rose leaf for a counterpane. Here she slept at night, but during the day she amused herself on a table, where the woman had placed a plateful of water. Round this plate were wreaths of flowers with their stems in the water, and upon it floated a large tulip leaf, which served Tiny for a boat. Here the little maiden sat and rowed herself from side to side, with 2 oars made of white horsehair. It really was a very pretty sight. Tiny could, also, sing so softly and sweetly that nothing like her singing had ever before been heard. One night, while she lay in her pretty bed, a large, ugly, wet toad crept through a broken pane of glass in the window, and leaped right upon the table where Tiny lay sleeping under her rose-leaf quilt. "What a pretty little wife this would make for my son," said the toad, and she took up the walnut shell in which little Tiny lay asleep, and jumped through the window with it into the garden. In the swampy margin of a broad stream in the garden lived the toad with her son. He was uglier even than his mother, and when he saw the pretty little maiden in her elegant bed, he could only cry, "Croak, croak, croak." "Don't speak so loud, or she will wake," said the toad, "and then she might run away, for she is as light as swan's down. We will place her on one of the water lily leaves out in the stream.
It will be like an island to her, she is so light and small, and then she cannot escape. And while she is away, we will make haste and prepare the stateroom under the marsh, in which you are to live when you are married."
Far out in the stream grew a number of water lilies, with broad green leaves, which seemed to float on top of the water. The largest of these leaves appeared farther off than the rest, and the old toad swam out to it with the walnut shell, in which little Tiny lay still asleep. The tiny little creature woke very early in the morning, and began to cry bitterly when she found where she was, for she could see nothing but water on every side of the large green leaf, and no way of reaching the land. Meanwhile the old toad was very busy under the marsh, decking her room with rushes and wild yellow flowers, to make it look pretty for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf on which she had placed poor little Tiny. She wanted to fetch the pretty bed, that she might put it in the bridal chamber to be ready for her. The old toad bowed low to her in the water, and said,
"Here is my son, he will be your husband, and you will live happily in the marsh by the stream."
"Croak, croak, croak," was all her son could say for himself. So the toad took up the elegant little bed, and swam away with it, leaving Tiny all alone on the green leaf, where she sat and wept. She could not bear to think of living with the old toad, and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes, who swam about in the water beneath, had seen the toad, and heard what she said, so they lifted their heads above the water to look at the little maiden. As soon as they caught sight of her, they saw she was very pretty, and it made them very sorry to think that she must go and live with the ugly toads.
"No, it must never be."
So they assembled together in the water, round the green stalk which held the leaf on which the little maiden stood, and gnawed it away at the root with their teeth. Then the leaf floated down the stream, carrying Tiny far away, out of reach of land. Tiny sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the bushes saw her, and sang, "What a lovely little creature!" So the leaf swam away with her farther and farther, till it brought her to other lands. A graceful little white butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last alighted on the leaf. Tiny pleased him, and she was glad of it, for now the toad could not possibly reach her, and the country through which she sailed was beautiful, and the sun shone upon the water till it glittered like liquid gold. She took off her girdle, and tied one end of it round the butterfly, and the other end of the ribbon she fastened to the leaf, which now glided on much faster than ever, taking little Tiny with it as she stood. Presently a large cockchafer flew by. The moment he caught sight of her, he seized her round her delicate waist with his claws, and flew her into a tree. The green leaf floated away on the brook, and the butterfly flew with it, for he was fastened to it and could not get away. Oh, how frightened little Tiny felt when the cockchafer flew with her to the tree! But especially was she sorry for the beautiful white butterfly which she had fastened to the leaf, for if he could not free himself he would die of hunger. But the cockchafer did not trouble himself at all about the matter. He seated himself beside her on a large green leaf, gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though not in the least like a cockchafer. After a time all the cockchafers turned up their feelers and said, "She has only 2 legs, how ugly that looks." "She has no feelers," said another. "Her waist is quite slim. Pooh, she is like a human being."
"Oh, she is ugly,"
said all the lady cockchafers, although Tiny was very pretty. Then the cockchafer who had run away with her believed all the others when they said she was ugly, and would have nothing more to say to her, and told her she might go where she liked. Then he flew down with her from the tree and placed her on a daisy, and she wept at the thought that she was so ugly that even the cockchafers would have nothing to say to her. And all the while she was really the loveliest creature that one could imagine, and as tender and delicate as a beautiful rose leaf. During the whole summer poor little Tiny lived quite alone in the wide forest. She wove herself a bed with blades of grass, and hung it up under a broad leaf to protect herself from the rain. She sucked the honey from the flowers for food, and drank the dew from their leaves every morning. So passed away the summer and the autumn, and then came the winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung to her so sweetly were flown away, and the trees and the flowers had withered. A large clover leaf, under the shelter of which she had lived, was now rolled together and shriveled up. Nothing remained but a yellow withered stalk. She felt dreadfully cold, for her clothes were torn, and she was herself so frail and delicate that poor little Tiny was nearly frozen to death. It began to snow, too, and the snowflakes, as they fell upon her, were like a whole shovelful falling upon one of us, for we are tall, but she was only an inch high. Then she wrapped herself up in a dry leaf, but it cracked in the middle and could not keep her warm, and she shivered with cold. Near the wood in which she had been living lay a cornfield, but the corn had been cut a long time. Nothing remained but the bare dry stubble standing up out of the frozen ground. It was to her like struggling through a large wood. Oh, how she shivered with the cold! She came at last to the door of a field mouse, who had a little den under the corn stubble. There dwelt the field mouse in warmth and comfort, with a whole roomful of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Poor little Tiny stood before the door just like a little beggar girl, and begged for a small piece of barley corn, for she had been without a morsel to eat for 2 days.
"You poor little creature,"
said the field mouse, who was really a good old field mouse.
"come into my warm room and dine with me."
She was very pleased with Tiny, so she said,
"You are quite welcome to stay with me all the winter, if you like. But you must keep my rooms clean and neat, and tell me stories, for I shall like to hear them very much."
And Tiny did all the field mouse asked her, and found herself very comfortable.
"We shall have a visitor soon,"
said the field mouse one day.
"My neighbor pays me a visit once a week. He is better off than I am. He has large rooms and wears a beautiful black velvet coat. If you could only have him for a husband, you would be well provided for indeed. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories."
But Tiny did not feel at all interested about this neighbor, for he was a mole. However, he came and paid his visit dressed in his black velvet coat.
"He is very rich and learned, and his house is 20 times larger than mine,"
said the field mouse. He was rich and learned, no doubt, but he always spoke slightingly of the sun and the pretty flowers, because he had never seen them. Tiny was obliged to sing to him, lady bird, fly away home," and many other pretty songs. And the mole fell in love with her because she had such a sweet voice. But he said nothing yet, for he was very cautious. A short time before, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth, which led from the dwelling of the field mouse to his own, and here she had permission to walk with Tiny whenever she liked. But he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passage. It was a perfect bird with a beak and feathers, and was just lying where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of phosphorescent wood in his mouth, and it glittered like fire in the dark. Then he went before them to light them through the long, dark passage. When they came to the spot where lay the dead bird, the mole pushed his broad nose through the ceiling, the earth gave way, so that there was a large hole, and the daylight shone into the passage. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, his beautiful wings pulled close to his sides, his feet and his head drawn up under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of the cold. It made little Tiny very sad to see it. She did so love the little birds. All the summer they had sung and twittered for her so beautifully. But the mole pushed it aside with his crooked legs, and said, "He will sing no more now. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird! I am thankful that none of my children will ever be birds, for they can do nothing but cry, tweet, tweet, and always die of hunger in the winter."
"Yes, you may well say that, as a clever man," exclaimed the field mouse. "What is the use of his twittering? For when winter comes, he must either starve or be frozen to death. Still, birds are very high bred."
Tiny said nothing, but when the two others had turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down and stroked aside the soft feathers which covered the head, and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly in the summer," she said. "And how much pleasure it gave me, you dear pretty bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone, and then accompanied the lady home. But during the night Tiny could not sleep, so she got out of bed and wove a large beautiful carpet of hay. Then she carried it to the dead bird, and spread it over him, with some down from the flowers which she had found in the field mouse's room. It was as soft as wool, and she spread some of it on each side of the bird, so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, you pretty little bird," said she. "Farewell. Thank you for your delightful singing during the summer, when all the trees were green, and the warm sun shone upon us." Then she laid her head on the bird's breast, but she was alarmed immediately, for it seemed as if something inside the bird went thump, thump. It was the bird's heart. He was not really dead, only benumbed with the cold, and the warmth had restored him to life. In autumn all the swallows fly away into warm countries, but if one happens to linger, the cold seizes it, it becomes frozen, and falls down as if dead. It remains where it fell, and the cold snow covers it. Tiny trembled very much. She was quite frightened, for the bird was large, a great deal larger than herself. She was only an inch high. But she took courage, laid the wool more thickly over the poor swallow, and then took a leaf which she had used for her own counterpane, and laid it over the head of the poor bird. The next morning she again stole out to see him. He was alive, but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment to look at Tiny, who stood by holding a piece of decayed wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern.
"Thank you, pretty little maiden," said the sick swallow. "I have been so nicely warmed that I shall soon regain my strength, and be able to fly about again in the warm sunshine."
"Oh," said she, "it is cold out of doors now. It snows and freezes. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought the swallow some water in a flower leaf, and after he had drank, he told her that he had wounded one of his wings in a thorn bush, and could not fly as fast as the others, who were soon far away on their journey to warm countries. Then at last he had fallen to the earth, and could remember no more, nor how he came to be where she had found him. The whole winter the swallow remained underground, and Tiny nursed him with care and love. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like swallows. Very soon the springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth. Then the swallow bade farewell to Tiny, and she opened the hole in the ceiling which the mole had made. The sun shone in upon them so beautifully that the swallow asked her if she would go with him. She could sit on his back, he said, and he would fly away with her into the green woods. But Tiny knew it would make the field mouse very grieved if she left her in that manner, so she said, "No, I cannot."
"Farewell, then, farewell, you good pretty little maiden,"
said the swallow, and he flew out into the sunshine. Tiny looked after him, and the tears rose in her eyes. She was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, as he flew out into the green woods, and Tiny felt very sad. She was not allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The corn which had been sown in the field over the house of the field mouse had grown up high into the air, and formed a thick wood to Tiny, who was only an inch in height.
"You are going to be married, Tiny,"
said the field mouse.
"My neighbor has asked for you. What good fortune for a poor child like you! Now we will prepare your wedding clothes. They must be both woolen and linen. Nothing must be wanting when you are the mole's wife."
Tiny had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders, who were to weave day and night. Every evening the mole visited her, and was continually speaking of the time when the summer would be over. Then he would keep his wedding day with Tiny. But now the heat of the sun was so great that it burned the earth, and made it quite hard, like a stone. As soon as the summer was over, the wedding should take place. But Tiny was not at all pleased, for she did not like the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it went down, she would creep out at the door, and as the wind blew aside the ears of corn, so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how beautiful and bright it seemed out there, and wished so much to see her dear swallow again. But he never returned, for by this time he had flown far away into the lovely green forest. When autumn arrived, Tiny had her outfit quite ready, and the field mouse said to her,
"In 4 weeks the wedding must take place."
Then Tiny wept, and said she would not marry the disagreeable mole.
"Nonsense,"
replied the field mouse.
"Now don't be so obstinate, or I shall bite you with my white teeth. He is a very handsome mole. The queen herself does not wear more beautiful velvets and furs. His kitchen and cellars are quite full. You ought to be very thankful for such good fortune."
So the wedding day was fixed, on which the mole was to fetch Tiny away to live with him, deep under the earth, and never again to see the warm sun, because he did not like it. The poor child was very unhappy at saying good-bye to the beautiful sun, and as the field mouse had given her permission to stand at the door, she went to look at it once more. "Farewell, bright sun," she cried, stretching out her arms towards it, and then she walked a short distance from the house, for the corn had been cut, and only the dry stubble remained in the fields. "Farewell, farewell," she repeated, twining her arms round a little red flower that grew just by her side. "Greet the little swallow from me, if you should see him again." "Tweet, tweet," sounded over her head suddenly. She looked up, and there was the swallow himself, flying close by. As soon as he spied Tiny, he was delighted, and then she told him how unwilling she felt to marry the ugly mole, and to live always beneath the earth, and never to see the bright sun any more. And as she told him, she wept. "Cold winter is coming," said the swallow, "and I am going to fly away into warmer countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back and fasten yourself on with your sash. Then we can fly away from the ugly mole and his gloomy rooms, far away, over the mountains into warmer countries, where the sun shines more brightly than here, where it is always summer and the flowers bloom in greater beauty. Fly now with me, dear little Tiny. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark passage." "Yes, I will go with you," said Tiny, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outstretched wings, and tied her girdle to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow rose in the air and flew over forest and over sea, high above the highest mountains, covered with eternal snow. Tiny would have been frozen in the cold air, but she crept under the bird's warm feathers, keeping her little head uncovered, so that she might admire the beautiful lands over which they passed. At length they reached the warm countries, where the sun shines brightly, and the sky seems so much higher above the earth. Here, on the hedges and by the wayside, grew purple, green, and white grapes. Lemons and oranges hung from the trees in the woods, and the air was fragrant with myrtles and orange blossoms. Beautiful children ran along the country lanes, playing with large gay butterflies, and as the swallow flew farther and farther, every place appeared still more lovely. At last they came to a blue lake, and by the side of it, shaded by trees of the deepest green, stood a palace of dazzling white marble, built in the olden times. Vines clustered round its lofty pillars, and at the top were many swallows' nests, and one of these was the home of the swallow who carried Tiny. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not do for you to live there. You would not be comfortable. You must choose for yourself one of those lovely flowers, and I will put you down upon it, and then you shall have everything that you can wish to make you happy." "That will be delightful," she said, and clapped her little hands for joy. A large marble pillar lay on the ground, which, in falling, had been broken into 3 pieces. Between these pieces grew the most beautiful large white flowers, so the swallow flew down with Tiny and placed her on one of the broad leaves. But how surprised she was to see in the middle of the flower a tiny little man, as white and transparent as if he had been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head, and delicate wings at his shoulders, and was not much larger than Tiny herself. He was the angel of the flower, for a tiny man and a tiny woman dwell in every flower, and this was the king of them all. "Oh, how beautiful he is!" whispered Tiny to the swallow. The little prince was at first quite frightened at the bird, who was like a giant compared to such a delicate little creature as himself, but when he saw Tiny he was delighted, and thought her the prettiest little maiden he had ever seen. He took the gold crown from his head and placed it on hers, and asked her name, and if she would be his wife, and queen over all the flowers. This certainly was a very different sort of husband to the son of a toad, or the mole with my black velvet and fur. So she said, "Yes," to the handsome prince. Then all the flowers opened, and out of each came a little lady or a tiny lord, all so pretty it was quite a pleasure to look at them. Each of them brought Tiny a present, but the best gift was a pair of beautiful wings, which had belonged to a large white fly, and they fastened them to Tiny's shoulders, so that she might fly from flower to flower. Then there was much rejoicing, and the little swallow who sat above them in his nest was asked to sing a wedding song, which he did as well as he could, but in his heart he felt sad, for he was very fond of Tiny, and would have liked never to part from her again. "You must not be called Tiny any more," said the spirit of the flowers to her. "It is an ugly name, and you are so very pretty. We will call you Maya."
"Farewell, farewell,"
said the swallow, with a heavy heart, as he left the warm countries to fly back into Denmark. There he had a nest over the window of a house in which dwelt the writer of fairy tales. The swallow sang, "Tweet, tweet," and from his song came the whole story. End of Little Tiny, or Thumbelina, by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Deborah Knight, October 31st, 2013. Section 4 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Old Man and His Grandson. There once was a very old man, whose eyes had become dim, his ears dull of hearing. His knees trembled, and when he sat at table he could hardly hold the spoon, and spilt the broth upon the tablecloth, or let it run out of his mouth. His son and his son's wife were disgusted at this, so the old grandfather at last had to sit in the corner behind the stove, and they gave him his food in an earthenware bowl, and not even enough of it. And he used to look towards the table with his eyes full of tears. Once, too, his trembling hands could not hold the bowl, and it fell to the ground and broke. The young wife scolded him, but he said nothing, and only sighed. Then they brought him a wooden bowl for a few halfpence, out of which he had to eat. They were once sitting thus when the little grandson of 4 years old began to gather together some bits of wood upon the ground. "What are you doing there?" asked the father. "I am making a little trough," answered the child, "for father and mother to eat out of when I am big." The man and his wife looked at each other for a while, and presently began to cry. Then they took the old grandfather to the table, and henceforth always let him eat with them, and likewise said nothing if he did spill a little of anything. End of The Old Man and His Grandson, by the Brothers Grimm, also known as the Grimm Brothers. Read by Deborah Knight, October 31st, 2013. Section 5 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. She was good for nothing. The mayor stood at the open window. He looked smart for his shirt frill, in which he had stuck a breastpin, and his ruffles were very fine. He had shaved his chin uncommonly smooth, although he had cut himself slightly, and had stuck a piece of newspaper over the place. "Harkee, youngster!" cried he. The boy to whom he spoke was no other than the son of a poor washerwoman, who was just going past the house. He stopped and respectfully took off his cap. The peak of this cap was broken in the middle, so that he could easily roll it up and put it in his pocket. He stood before the mayor in his poor but clean and well-mended clothes, with heavy wooden shoes on his feet, looking as humble as if it had been the king himself. "You are a good and civil boy," said the mayor. "I suppose your mother is busy washing the clothes down by the river, and you are going to carry that thing to her that you have in your pocket. It is very bad for your mother. How much have you got in it?" "Only half a quartern," stammered the boy, in a frightened voice. "And she has had just as much this morning already?" "No, it was yesterday," replied the boy. "Two halves make a whole," said the mayor. "She's good for nothing. What a sad thing it is with these people. Tell your mother she ought to be ashamed of herself. Don't you become a drunkard, but I expect you will, though. Poor child. There, go now." The boy went on his way with his cap in his hand, while the wind fluttered his golden hair till the locks stood up straight. He turned round the corner of the street into the little lane that led to the river, where his mother stood in the water by her washing bench, beating the linen with a heavy wooden bar. The floodgates at the mill had been drawn up, and as the water rolled rapidly on, the sheets were dragged along by the stream, and nearly overturned the bench, so that the washerwoman was obliged to lean against it to keep it steady. "I have been very nearly carried away," she said. "It is a good thing that you are come, for I want something to strengthen me. It is cold in the water, and I have stood here 6 hours. Have you brought anything for me?" The boy drew the bottle from his pocket, and the mother put it to her lips, and drank a little. "Ah, how much good that does, and how it warms me," she said. "It is as good as a hot meal, and not so dear. Drink a little, my boy. You look quite pale. You are shivering in your thin clothes, and autumn has really come. Oh, how cold the water is! I hope I shall not be ill. But no, I must not be afraid of that. Give me a little more, and you may have a sip too, but only a sip. You must not get used to it, my poor dear child." She stepped up to the bridge on which the boy stood as she spoke, and came on shore. The water dripped from the straw mat which she had bound round her body, and from her gown. "I work hard and suffer pain with my poor hands," said she, "but I do it willingly that I may be able to bring you up honestly and truthfully, my dear boy." At the same moment a woman, rather older than herself, came towards them. She was a miserable looking object, lame of one leg, and with a large false curl hanging down over one of her eyes, which was blind. This curl was intended to conceal the blind eye, but it made the defect only more visible. She was a friend of the laundress, and was called among the neighbors Lame Martha with the curl. "Oh, you poor thing! How you do work, standing there in the water!" she exclaimed. "You really do need something to give you a little warmth, and yet spiteful people cry out about the few drops you take." And then Martha repeated to the laundress in a very few minutes all that the mayor had said to her boy, which she had overheard, and she felt very angry that any man could speak, as he had done, of a mother to her own child, about the few drops she had taken. And she was still more angry because on that very day the mayor was going to have a dinner party, at which there would be wine, strong, rich wine, drunk by the bottle. "Many will take more than they ought, but they don't call that drinking. They are all right. You are good for nothing indeed," cried Martha indignantly. "And so he spoke to you in that way, did he, my child?" said the washerwoman, and her lips trembled as she spoke. "He says you have a mother who is good for nothing. Well, perhaps he is right, but he should not have said it to my child. How much has happened to me from that house!" "Yes," said Martha, "I remember you were in service there, and lived in the house when the mayor's parents were alive. How many years ago that is! Bushels of salt have been eaten since then, and people may well be thirsty." And Martha smiled. "The mayor's great dinner party to-day ought to have been put off, but the news came too late. The footman told me the dinner was already cooked, when a letter came to say that the mayor's younger brother in Copenhagen is dead." "Dead!" cried the laundress, turning pale as death. "Yes, certainly," replied Martha, "but why do you take it so much to heart? I suppose you knew him years ago, when you were in service there?" "Is he dead?" she exclaimed. "Oh, he was such a kind, good-hearted man. There are not many like him. and the tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke. Then she cried, "Oh, dear me, I feel quite ill. Everything is going round me. I cannot bear it. Is the bottle empty?" And she leaned against the plank. "Dear me, you are ill indeed," said the other woman. "Come, cheer up, perhaps it will pass off." "No, indeed, I see you are really ill. The best thing for me to do is to lead you home." "But my washing yonder?" "I will take care of that. Come, give me your arm. The boy can stay here and take care of the linen, and I'll come back and finish the washing. It is but a trifle." The limbs of the laundress shook under her, and she said, "I have stood too long in the cold water, and I have had nothing to eat the whole day since the morning. Oh, kind Heaven, help me to get home. I am in a burning fever. Oh, my poor child!" And she burst into tears. And he, poor boy, wept also, as he sat alone by the river, near to and watching the damp linen. The two women walked very slowly. The laundress slipped and tottered through the lane, and round the corner into the street where the mayor lived, and just as she reached the front of his house, she sank down upon the pavement. Many persons came round her, and lame Martha ran into the house for help. The mayor and his guests came to the window. "Oh, it is the laundress," said he. "She has had a little drop too much. She is good for nothing. It is a sad thing for her pretty little son. I like the boy very well, but the mother is good for nothing." After a while the laundress recovered herself, and they led her to her poor dwelling, and put her to bed. Kind Martha warmed a mug of beer for her, with butter and sugar. She considered this the best medicine, and then hastened to the river, washed and rinsed, badly enough, to be sure, but she did her best. Then she drew the linen ashore, wet as it was, and laid it in a basket. Before evening she was sitting in the poor little room with the laundress. The mayor's cook had given her some roasted potatoes and a beautiful piece of fat for the sick woman. Martha and the boy enjoyed these good things very much, but the sick woman could only say that the smell was very nourishing, she thought. By and by the boy was put to bed, in the same bed as the one in which his mother lay, but he slept at her feet, covered with an old quilt made of blue and white patchwork. The laundress felt a little better by this time. The warm beer had strengthened her, and the smell of the good food had been pleasant to her. "Many thanks, you good soul," she said to Martha. "Now the boy is asleep, I will tell you all. He is soon asleep. How gentle and sweet he looks as he lies there with his eyes closed. He does not know how his mother has suffered, and Heaven grant he never may know it. I was in service at the councillor's, the father of the mayor, and it happened that the youngest of his sons, the student, came home. I was a young wild girl then, but honest. That I can declare in the sight of Heaven. The student was merry and gay, brave and affectionate. Every drop of blood in him was good and honorable. A better man never lived on earth. He was the son of the house, and I was only a maid. But he loved me truly and honorably, and he told his mother of this. She was to him as an angel upon earth, she was so wise and loving. He went to travel, and before he started he placed a gold ring on my finger, and as soon as he was out of the house, my mistress sent for me. Gently and earnestly she drew me to her, and spake as if an angel were speaking. She showed me clearly, in spirit and in truth, the difference there was between him and me. "He is pleased now," she said, "with your pretty face, but good looks do not last long. You have not been educated like he has. You are not equals in mind and rank, and therein lies the misfortune. I esteem the poor, she added. In the sight of God they may occupy a higher place than many of the rich, but here upon earth we must beware of entering upon a false track, lest we are overturned in our plans, like a carriage that travels by a dangerous road. I know a worthy man, an artisan, who wishes to marry you. I mean Eric, the glove maker. He is a widower, without children, and in a good position. Will you think it over?" Every word she said pierced my heart like a knife, but I knew she was right, and the thought pressed heavily upon me. I kissed her hand and wept bitter tears, and I wept still more when I went to my room and threw myself on my bed. I passed through a dreadful night. God knows what I suffered, and how I struggled. The following Sunday I went to the house of God to pray for light to direct my path. It seemed like a providence that as I stepped out of church Eric came towards me. And then there remained not a doubt in my mind. We were suited to each other in rank and circumstances. He was, even then, a man of good means. I went up to him and took his hand, and said, "Do you still feel the same for me?" "Yes, ever and always," said he. "Will you, then, marry a maiden who honors and esteems you, although she cannot offer you her love, but that may come?" "Yes, it will come," said he, and we joined our hands together, and I went home to my mistress. The gold ring which her son had given me I wore next to my heart. I could not place it on my finger during the daytime, but only in the evening when I went to bed. I kissed the ring till my lips almost bled, and then I gave it to my mistress, and told her that the banns were to be put up for me and the glove maker the following week. Then my mistress threw her arms round me and kissed me. She did not say that I was good for nothing. Very likely I was better then than I am now, but the misfortunes of this world were unknown to me then. At Michaelmas we were married, and for the first year everything went well with us. We had a journeyman and an apprentice, and you were our servant, Martha. "Ah, yes, and you were a dear, good mistress," said Martha. "I shall never forget how kind you and your husband were to me." "Yes, those were happy years when you were with us, although we had no children at first. The student I never met again, yet I saw him once, although he did not see me. He came to his mother's funeral. I saw him, looking pale as death, and deeply troubled, standing at her grave, for she was his mother. Some time after, when his father died, he was in foreign lands, and did not come home. I know that he never married. I believe he became a lawyer. He had forgotten me, and even had we met he would not have known me, for I have lost all my good looks, and perhaps that is all for the best." And then she spoke of the dark days of trial when misfortune had fallen upon them. "We had $500, she said, "and there was a house in the street to be sold for $200, so we thought it would be worth our while to pull it down and build a new one in its place. So it was bought. The builder and carpenter made an estimate that the new house would cost $1,020 to build. Eric had credit, so he borrowed the money in the chief town, but the captain, who was bringing it to him, was shipwrecked, and the money lost. Just about this time my dear sweet boy who lies sleeping there was born, and my husband was attacked with a severe lingering illness. For 3/4 of a year I was obliged to dress and undress him. We were backward in our payments. We borrowed more money, and all that we had was lost and sold, and then my husband died. Since then I have worked, toiled, and striven for the sake of the child. I have scrubbed and washed both coarse and fine linen, but I have not been able to make myself better off. and it was God's will. In his own time he will take me to himself, but I know he will never forsake my boy." Then she fell asleep. In the morning she felt much refreshed, and strong enough, as she thought, to go on with her work. But as soon as she stepped into the cold water, a sudden faintness seized her. She clutched at the air convulsively with her hand, took one step forward, and fell. Her head rested on dry land, but her feet were in the water. Her wooden shoes, which were only tied on by a wisp of straw, were carried away by the stream, and thus she was found by Martha when she came to bring her some coffee. In the meantime a messenger had been sent to her house by the mayor, to say that she must come to him immediately, as he had something to tell her. It was too late. A surgeon had been sent for to open a vein in her arm, but the poor woman was dead. "She had drunk herself to death," said the cruel mayor. In the letter containing the news of his brother's death, it was stated that he had left in his will a legacy of $600 to the glove maker's widow, who had been his mother's maid, to be paid with discretion in large or small sums to the widow or her child. "There was something between my brother and her, I remember," said the mayor. "It is a good thing that she is out of the way, for now the boy will have the whole. I will place him with honest people to bring him up, that he may become a respectable working man." And the blessing of God rested upon these words. The mayor sent for the boy to come to him, and promised to take care of him, but most cruelly added that it was a good thing that his mother was dead, for "she was good for nothing." They carried her to the churchyard in which the poor were buried. Martha strewed sand on the grave, and planted a rose tree upon it, and the boy stood by her side. "Oh, my poor mother!" he cried, while the tears rolled down his cheeks. "Is it true what they say, that she was good for nothing?" "No, indeed it is not true," replied the old servant, raising her eyes to heaven. "She was worth a great deal. I knew it years ago, and since the last night of her life I am more certain of it than ever. I say she was a good and worthy woman, and God, who is in heaven, knows I am speaking the truth, though the world may say, even now, she was good for nothing." End of She Was Good for Nothing by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Deborah Knight. October 31st, 2013. Section 6 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Emperor's New Suit by Hans Christian Andersen. Many, many years ago lived an emperor who thought so much of new clothes that he spent all his money in order to obtain them. His only ambition was to be always well dressed. He did not care for his soldiers, and the theater did not amuse him. The only thing, in fact, he thought anything of was to drive out and show a new suit of clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day, and, as one would say of a king, he is in his cabinet. So one could say of him, the emperor is in his dressing room. The great city where he resided was very gay. Every day many strangers from all parts of the globe arrived. One day 2 swindlers came to this city. They made people believe that they were weavers, and declared they could manufacture the finest cloth to be imagined. Their colors and patterns, they said, were not only exceptionally beautiful, but the cloths made of their material possessed the wonderful quality of being invisible to any man who was unfit for his office or unpardonably stupid. "That must be wonderful cloth," thought the emperor. If I were to be dressed in a suit made of this cloth, I should be able to find out which men in my empire were unfit for their places, and I could distinguish the clever from the stupid. I must have this cloth woven for me without delay." And he gave a large sum of money to the swindlers in advance, that they should set to work without any loss of time. They set up 2 looms and pretended to be very hard at work, but they did nothing whatever on the looms. They asked for the finest silk and the most precious gold cloth. All they got they did away with, and worked at the empty looms till late at night. "I should like very much to know how they are getting on with the cloth," thought the emperor, but he felt rather uneasy when he remembered that he who was not fit for his office could not see it. Personally, he was of opinion that he had nothing to fear, yet he thought it advisable to send somebody else first to see how matters stood. Everybody in the town knew what a remarkable quality the stuff possessed, and all were anxious to see how bad or stupid their neighbors were. "I shall send my honest old minister to the weavers," thought the emperor. "He can judge best how the stuff looks, for he is intelligent, and nobody understands his office better than he." The good old minister went into the room where the swindlers sat before the empty looms. "Heaven preserve us!" he thought, and opened his eyes wide. "I cannot see anything at all." But he did not say so. Both swindlers requested him to come near, and asked him if he did not admire the exquisite pattern and the beautiful colors, pointing to the empty looms. The poor old minister tried his very best, but he could see nothing, for there was nothing to be seen. "Oh, dear," he thought, "can I be so stupid? I should never have thought so, and nobody must know it. Is it possible that I am not fit for my office? No, no, I cannot say that I was unable to see the cloth." "Now, have you got nothing to say?" said one of the swindlers, while he pretended to be busily weaving. "Oh, it is very pretty, exceedingly beautiful," replied the old minister, looking through his glasses. "What a beautiful pattern! What brilliant colors! I shall tell the emperor that I like the cloth very much." "We are pleased to hear that," said the 2 weavers, and described to him the colors and explained the curious pattern. The old minister listened attentively that he might relate to the emperor what they said, and so he did. Soon afterwards the emperor sent another honest courtier to the weavers to see how they were getting on, and if the cloth was nearly finished. Like the old minister, he looked and looked, but could see nothing, as there was nothing to be seen. "Is it not a beautiful piece of cloth?" asked the 2 swindlers, showing and explaining the magnificent pattern, which, however, did not exist. "I am not stupid," said the man. "It is therefore my good appointment for which I am not fit. It is very strange, but I must not let anyone know it." And he praised the cloth, which he did not see, and expressed his joy at the beautiful colors and the fine pattern. "It is very excellent," he said to the emperor. Everybody in the whole town talked about the precious cloth. At last the emperor wished to see it himself, while it was still on the loom. With a number of courtiers, including the 2 who had already been there, he went to the 2 clever swindlers, who now worked as hard as they could, but without using any thread. "Is it not magnificent?" said the 2 old statesmen who had been there before. "Your Majesty must admire the colors and the pattern." And they pointed to the empty looms, for they imagined the others could see the cloth. "What is this?" thought the emperor. "I do not see anything at all. That is terrible. Am I stupid? Am I unfit to be emperor? That would indeed be the most dreadful thing that could happen to me. Really," he said, turning to the weavers, "your cloth has our most gracious approval." And nodding contentedly, he looked at the empty loom, for he did not like to say that he saw nothing. All his attendants who were with him looked and looked, and although they could not see anything more than the others, they said, like the emperor, "It is very beautiful," and all advised him to wear the new magnificent cloths at a great procession which was soon to take place. "It is magnificent, beautiful, excellent," one heard them say. Everybody seemed to be delighted, and the emperor appointed the two swindlers imperial court weavers. The whole night previous to the day on which the procession was to take place, the swindlers pretended to work, and burned more than 16 candles. People should see that they were busy to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to take the cloth from the loom, and worked about in the air with big scissors, and sewed with needles without thread, and said at last, "The emperor's new suit is ready now." The emperor and all his barons then came to the hall. The swindlers held their arms up as if they held something in their hands, and said, "These are the trousers, this is the coat, and here is the cloak," and so on. They are all as light as a cobweb, and one must feel as if one had nothing at all upon the body, but that is just the beauty of them. "Indeed," said all the courtiers, but they could not see anything, for there was nothing to be seen. "Does it please your majesty now to graciously undress," said the swindlers, "that we may assist your majesty in putting on the new suit before the large looking-glass?" The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put the new suit upon him, one piece after another, and the emperor looked at himself in the glass from every side. "How well they look! How well they fit!" said all. "What a beautiful pattern! What fine colors! That is a magnificent suit of clothes." The master of the ceremonies announced that the bearers of the canopy, which was to be carried in the procession, were ready. "I am ready," said the emperor. "Does not my suit fit me marvelously?" Then he turned once more to the looking-glass, that people should think he admired his garments. The chamberlains, who were to carry the train, stretched their hands to the ground as if they lifted up a train, and pretended to hold something in their hands. They did not like people to know that they could not see anything. The emperor marched in the procession under the beautiful canopy, and all who saw him in the street and out of the windows exclaimed, "Indeed, the emperor's new suit is incomparable! What a long train he has! How well it fits him!" Nobody wished to let others know he saw nothing, for then he would have been unfit for his office or too stupid. Never emperor's clothes were more admired.
"But he has nothing on at all,"
said a little child at last. "Good heavens, listen to the voice of an innocent child," said the father, and one whispered to the other what the child had said. "But he has nothing on at all," cried at last the whole people. That made a deep impression upon the emperor, for it seemed to him that they were right, but he thought to himself, "Now I must bear up to the end." And the chamberlains walked with still greater dignity, as if they carried the train which did not exist. End of The Emperor's New Suit, read by Deborah Knight, November 6, 2013. Section 7 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jack and the Beanstalk. Once upon a time there lived a poor widow who had an only son named Jack. She was very poor, for times had been hard, and Jack was too young to work. Almost all the furniture of the little cottage had been sold to buy bread, until at last there was nothing left worth selling. Only the good cow, Milky White, remained, and she gave milk every morning, which they took to market and sold. But one sad day Milky White gave no milk, and then things looked bad indeed. "Never mind, mother," said Jack. "We must sell Milky White. Trust me to make a good bargain." And away he went to the market. For some time he went along very sadly, but after a little he quite recovered his spirits. "I may as well ride as walk," said he. So, instead of leading the cow by the halter, he jumped on her back, and so he went whistling along until he met a butcher. "Good morning," said the butcher. "Good morning, sir," answered Jack. "Where are you going?" said the butcher. "I am going to market to sell the cow." "It's lucky I met you," said the butcher. "You may save yourself the trouble of going so far." With this he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out 5 curious-looking beans. "What do you call these?" he said. "Beans," said Jack. "Yes," said he, "beans, but they're the most wonderful beans that ever were known. If you plant them overnight, by the next morning they'll grow up and reach the sky. But to save you the trouble of going all the way to market, I don't mind exchanging them for that cow of yours." "Done!" cried Jack, who was so delighted with the bargain that he ran all the way home to tell his mother how lucky he had been. But oh, how disappointed the poor widow was. "Off to bed with you!" she cried, and she was so angry that she threw the beans out of the window into the garden. So poor Jack went to bed without any supper, and cried himself to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the room was almost dark, and Jack jumped out of bed and ran to the window to see what was the matter. The sun was shining brightly outside, but from the ground, right up beside his window there, was growing a great beanstalk, which stretched up and up, as far as he could see, into the sky. "I'll just see where it leads to," thought Jack, and with that he stepped out of the window onto the beanstalk and began to climb upwards. He climbed up and up, till after a time his mother's cottage looked a mere speck below. But at last the stalk ended, and he found himself in a new and beautiful country. A little way off there was a great castle, with a broad road leading straight up to the front gate. But what most surprised Jack was to find a beautiful maiden suddenly standing beside him. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, very politely. "Good morning, Jack," said she, and Jack was more surprised than ever, for he could not imagine how she had learned his name. But he soon found that she knew a great deal more about him than his name, for she told him how, when he was quite a little baby, his father, a gallant knight, had been slain by the giant who lived in yonder castle, and how his mother, in order to save Jack, had been obliged to promise never to tell the secret. "All that the giant has is yours," she said, and then disappeared quite as suddenly as she came. "She must be a fairy," thought Jack. As he drew near to the castle, he saw the giant's wife standing at the door. "If you please, ma'am," said he, "would you kindly give me some breakfast? I have had nothing to eat since yesterday." Now, the giant's wife, although very big and very ugly, had a kind heart, so she said, "Very well, little man, come in. But you must be quick about it, for if my husband, the giant, finds you here, he will eat you up, bones and all." So in Jack went, and the giant's wife gave him a good breakfast. But before he had half finished it, there came a terrible knock at the front door, which seemed to shake even the thick walls of the castle. "Dearie me, that is my husband," said the giantess, in a terrible fright. "We must hide you somehow," and she lifted Jack up and popped him into the empty kettle. No sooner had the giant's wife opened the door than her husband roared out, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. It's a boy, I'm sure 'tis," he continued. "Where is he? I'll have him for my breakfast." "Nonsense," said his wife, "you must be mistaken. It's the ox's hide you smell." So he sat down and ate up the greater part of the ox. When he had finished, he said, "Wife, bring me my money bags." So his wife brought him 2 full bags of gold, and the giant began to count his money. But he was so sleepy that his head soon began to nod, and then he began to snore, like the rumbling of thunder. Then Jack crept out, snatched up the 2 bags, and, though the giant's dog barked loudly, he made his way down the beanstalk back to the cottage before the giant awoke. Jack and his mother were now quite rich, but it occurred to him one day that he would like to see how matters were going on at the giant's castle. So, while his mother was away at market, he climbed up, and up, and up, and up, until he got to the top of the beanstalk again. The giantess was standing at the door just as before, but she did not know Jack, who, of course, was more finely dressed than on his first visit. "If you please, ma'am," said he, "will you give me some breakfast?" "Run away," said she, "or my husband the giant will eat you up, bones and all. The last boy who came here stole 2 bags of gold. Off with you." But the giantess had a kind heart, and after a time she allowed Jack to come into the kitchen, where she set before him enough breakfast to last him a week. Scarcely had he begun to eat than there was a great rumbling like an earthquake, and the giantess had only time to bundle Jack into the oven when in came the giant. No sooner was he inside the room than he roared, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." But his wife told him he was mistaken, and after breakfasting off a roasted bullock, just as if it were a lark, he called out, "Wife, bring the little brown hen." The giantess went out and brought in a little brown hen, which she placed on the table. "Lay," said the giant, and the hen at once laid a golden egg. "Lay," said the giant a second time, and she laid another golden egg. "Lay," said the giant a third time, and she laid a third golden egg. "That will do for today," said he, and stretched himself out to go to sleep. As soon as he began to snore, Jack crept out of the oven, went on tiptoe to the table, and, snatching up the little brown hen, made a dash for the door. Then the hen began to cackle, and the giant began to wake up. But before he was quite awake, Jack had escaped from the castle, and, climbing as fast as he could down the beanstalk, got safe home to his mother's cottage. The little brown hen laid so many golden eggs that Jack and his mother had now more money than they could spend. But Jack was always thinking about the beanstalk, and one day he crept out of the window again and climbed up and up and up and up until he reached the top. This time, you may be sure, he was careful not to be seen. So he crept round to the back of the castle, and when the giant's wife went out, he slipped into the kitchen and hid himself in the oven. In came the giant, roaring louder than ever. "Fee, fi, fo, fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." But the giantess was quite sure that she had seen no little boys that morning, and after grumbling a great deal, the giant sat down to breakfast. Even then he was not quite satisfied, for every now and again he would say, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman." And once he got up and looked in the kettle. But, of course, Jack was in the oven all the time. When the giant had finished, he called out, "Wife, bring me the golden harp." So she brought in the golden harp and placed it on the table. "Sing," said the giant, and the harp at once began to sing the most beautiful songs that ever were heard. It sang so sweetly that the giant soon fell fast asleep, and then Jack crept quietly out of the oven, and, going on tiptoe to the table, seized hold of the golden harp. But the harp at once called out, "Master! Master!" and the giant woke up just in time to catch sight of Jack running out of the kitchen door. With a fearful roar he seized his oak tree club and dashed after Jack, who held the harp tight and ran faster than he had ever run before. The giant, brandishing his club and taking terribly long strides, gained on Jack at every instant, and he would have been caught if the giant hadn't slipped over a boulder. Before he could pick himself up, Jack began to climb down the beanstalk, and when the giant arrived at the edge, he was nearly halfway to the cottage. The giant began to climb down too, but as soon as Jack saw him coming, he called out, "Mother, bring me an axe!" And the widow hurried out with a chopper. Jack had no sooner reached the ground than he cut the beanstalk right in two. Down came the giant with a terrible crash, and that, you may be sure, was the end of him. What became of the giantess and the castle, nobody knows. But Jack and his mother grew very rich and lived happily ever after. End of Jack and the Beanstalk. Recording by Deborah Knight. November 11th, 2013. Section 8 of Grandma Knight's Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Little Red Riding Hood. In a great wide forest, full of beautiful trees, and green glades, and thorny thickets, there lived a long time ago a woodcutter and his wife, who had only one child, a little girl. She was so pretty and so good that the sun seemed to shine more brightly when its light fell upon her rosy little face, and the birds would seem to sing more sweetly when she was passing by. Her real name was Maisie, but the neighbors round about all called her Little Red Riding Hood, because of a scarlet riding hood and cloak that her kind old grandmother had made for her, and which she nearly always wore. She was a happy, merry little child, with a smile and a gentle word for everybody, and so you may easily believe that everybody loved her, and was glad to catch a glimpse of her golden curls and her scarlet cloak as she tripped along, singing under the green boughs. Now this, let me tell you, before I forget, was at the time when all the birds and beasts, or very nearly all, could speak just as well as you or I, and nobody was surprised to hear them talk, as I suppose one would be nowadays. Well, as I was saying, Little Red Riding Hood lived with her parents in a little white cottage with a green door and a thatched roof, and red and white roses climbing all over the walls, and even putting their pretty heads in at the latticed windows to peep at the child who was so like them. It was on a bright spring morning early in May, when Little Red Riding Hood had just finished putting away the breakfast cups, that her mother came bustling in from the dairy. "Here's a to-do," she said. "Farmer Hodge has this very minute told me that he hears your granny isn't quite well, and I can't leave the cheese-making this morning for love or money. Do you go, my dear, and find out how she is, and stay. Take her this little pot of sweet fresh butter, and these 2 new-laid eggs, and these nice tasty little pasties. Maybe they'll tempt her to eat a bit. Here's your basket, and don't be too long away, honey." So Little Red Riding Hood pulled her hood over her curls, and set off down the sunny green slope, with her basket in her hand, at a brisk pace. But as she got deeper into the forest, she walked more slowly. Everything was so beautiful. The great trees waved their huge arms over her. The birds were calling to one another from the thorns all white with blossom. And the child began singing as she went. She could not have told why, but I think it was because the beautiful world made her feel glad. The path wound along through the trees, and as it grew wider after turning a corner, Red Riding Hood saw that she was likely to have company on her walk, for where two cross paths divided, there sat a big gray wolf, licking his long paws and looking sharply about him. And "Good morning, Red Riding Hood," said he. "Good morning, Mr. Wolf," she answered. "And where may you be going, sweet lass?" said the wolf, as he walked beside her.
"Oh, Granny isn't very well, and Mother cannot leave the cheese making this morning, so I'm taking her some little dainties in my basket, and I am to see how she is, and tell Mother when I get back,"
said the child, with a smile.
"And," said the wolf, "where does your good granny live, little lady?"
"Through the copse, and down the hollow, and over the bridge, and 3 meadows after the mill."
"Does she indeed?" cried he. "Why, then, I do believe she is a very dear old friend of mine, whom I have not seen for years and years. Now I'll tell you what we'll do, you and I. I will go by this way, and you shall take that, and whoever gets there first shall be the winner of the game."
So the wolf trotted off one way, and Red Riding Hood went the other, and I am sorry to say that she lingered and loitered more than she ought to have done on the road. Well, what with one thing and another, the sun was right up in the very midmost middle of the sky when she crossed the last meadow from the mill and came in sight of her grandmother's cottage and the big lilac bushes that grew by the garden gate. "Oh dear, how I must have lingered!" said the child, when she saw how high the sun had climbed since she set out on her journey, and, pattering up the garden path, she tapped at the cottage door.
"Who's there?"
said a very gruff kind of voice from inside.
"It's only I, Granny dear, your little Red Riding Hood, with some goodies for you in my basket," answered the child. "Then pull the bobbin," cried the voice, "and the latch will go up." "What a dreadful cold poor Granny must have, to be sure, to make her so hoarse," thought the child. Then she pulled the bobbin, and the latch went up, and Red Riding Hood pushed open the door and stepped inside the cottage. It seemed very dark in there after the bright sunlight outside, and all Red Riding Hood could see was that the window curtains and the bed curtains were still drawn, and her grandmother seemed to be lying in bed with the bedclothes pulled almost over her head, and her great white frilled nightcap nearly hiding her face. Now, you and I have guessed by this time, although poor Red Riding Hood never even thought of such a thing, that it was not her granny at all, but the wicked wolf, who had hurried to the cottage and put on Granny's nightcap and popped into her bed to pretend that he was Granny herself. And where was Granny all this time, you will say? Well, we shall see presently. "Come and sit down beside my bed, dearie," wheezed the wolf, "and let us have a little chat."
Then the wolf stretched out his large hairy paws and began to unfasten the basket. "Oh," said Red Riding Hood, "what great arms you have, Granny!"
"All the better to hug you with," said the wolf.
"And what great rough ears you have, Granny!"
"All the better to hear you with, my little dear."
"And your eyes, Granny! What great yellow eyes you have!"
"All the better to see you with, my pet,"
grinned the wolf. "And, oh, Granny!" cried the child in a sad fright. "What great sharp teeth you have!"
"All the better to eat you with,"
growled the wolf, springing up suddenly at Red Riding Hood. But just at that very moment the door flew open, and 2 tall woodcutters rushed in with their heavy axes and killed the wicked wolf in far less time than it takes me to tell you about it.
"But where is Granny?" asked Little Red Riding Hood, when she had thanked the brave woodcutters. "Oh, where can poor Granny be? Can the cruel wolf have eaten her up?" And she began to cry and sob bitterly, when who should walk in but Granny herself, as large as life, and as hearty as ever, with her marketing basket on her arm. For it was another old dame in the village who was not very well, and Granny had been down to visit her and give her some of her own famous herb tea. So everything turned out right in the end, and all lived happily ever after. But I promise you that Little Red Riding Hood never made friends with a wolf again. End of Little Red Riding Hood. Recording by Deborah Knight, November 11th, 2013. Section 9 of Grandma Knight's Tales, The Brownies, by Horatia Ewing. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1. "Children are a burden," said the tailor, as he sat on his bench, stitching away. "Children are a blessing," said the kind lady in the window. It was the tailor's mother who spoke. She was a very old woman and nearly helpless. All day she sat in a large armchair knitting rugs. "What have my two lads ever done to help me?" continued the tailor, sadly. "They do nothing but play. If I send Tommy on an errand, he loiters. If I ask him to work, he does it so unwillingly that I would rather do it myself. Since their mother died, I have indeed had a hard time." At this moment the two boys came in, their arms full of moss which they dropped on the floor. "Is there any supper, grandmother?" asked Tommy. "No, my child, only some bread for breakfast tomorrow." "Oh, grandmother, we are so hungry!" and the boys' eyes filled with tears. "What can I do for you, my poor children?" said the good woman. "Tell us a story, please, so that we can forget we are hungry. Tell us about the brownie that used to live in your grandfather's house. What was he like?" "Like a little man, they say." "What did he do?" "He came in early in the morning, before anyone in the house was awake, and lighted the fire, and swept the room, and set out the breakfast. He never would be seen, and was off before they could catch him. But they often heard him laughing and playing about the house. Did they give him any wages, grandmother?" "No, my dear. He did the work for love. They always set a pan of clear water for him, and now and then a bowl of bread and milk." "Oh, grandmother, where did he go?" "The old owl in the wood knows. I do not. When I was young, many people used to go to see the old owl at moonrise, and ask her what they wanted to know." "How I wish a brownie would come and live with us!" cried Tommy. "So do I," said Johnny. "Will you let us set out a pan of water for the brownie, father?" asked Tommy. "You may set out what you like, my lad, but you must go to bed now." The boys brought out a pan of water. Then they climbed the ladder to the loft over the kitchen. Johnny was soon in the land of dreams, but Tommy lay awake, thinking how he could find a brownie and get him to live in the house. "There is an owl that lives in the grove," he thought. "It may be the old owl herself. When the moon rises, I'll go and find her." Part 2. The moon rose like gold and went up in the heavens like silver. Tommy opened his eyes and ran to the window. "The moon has risen," said he, "and it is time for me to go." Downstairs he crept softly and out into the still night. "Hoot! Hoot!" cried a voice from the grove near the house. "That's the old owl," thought Tommy. He ran to a big tree and looked up. There he saw the old owl, sitting on a branch and staring at him with yellow eyes. "Oh, dear!" said Tommy, for he did not like the owl very well.
"Come up here, come up here," she cried. Tommy climbed the tree and sat face to face with her on the big branch. "Now, what do you want?" said the owl. "Please," said Tommy, "I want to know where to find the brownies, and how to get one to come and live with us." "Oh-hoo, oh-hoo," said the owl. "That's it, is it? I know of 3 brownies." "Hurrah!" said Tommy. "Where do they live?" "In your house," said the owl. "In our house? Whereabouts? Why don't they work?" cried Tommy. "One of them is too little," said the owl. "But why don't the other 2 do something?" said Tommy. "Nobody does any work at our house except father." "They are idle, they are idle," said the old owl. "Then we don't want them," said Tommy. "What is the use of having brownies in the house if they do nothing to help us?" "Perhaps they don't know what to do." "I wish you would tell me where to find them," said Tommy. "I could tell them what to do." "Could you? Could you? Oh-hoo, oh-hoo." And Tommy could not tell whether the owl was hooting or laughing. "Of course I could. They might get up early in the morning and sweep the house, and light the fire and spread the table before my father comes downstairs." "So they might," said the owl. "Well, I can tell you where to find one of the brownies, and he can tell you where to find his brother. Go to the north side of the pond, where the moon is shining on the water. Turn yourself around 3 times while you say this charm. Twist me and turn me and show me the elf I looked in the water and saw. Then look in the water and think of a word which rhymes with elf and make the charm complete." Tommy knew the place very well. He ran to the north side of the pond, and turning himself around 3 times, he repeated the charm. Then he looked in and saw himself. "Why, there's no one but myself. I can't think of the right word. What can it be? I'll go back and ask the old owl," thought Tommy, and back he went. There sat the owl as before. "Oh-hoo," said she, as Tommy climbed up. "Did you find out the word?" "No," said Tommy. "I could find no word that rhymes with elf except myself." "Well, that is the word. Now, do you know where your brother is?" "In bed in the loft," said Tommy. "Then all your questions are answered. Good night." And the old owl began to shake her feathers. "Don't go yet," said Tommy humbly. "I don't understand you. I am not a brownie, am I?" "Yes, you are, and a very idle one, too," said the old owl. "All children are brownies." "But are there really any brownies except children?" inquired Tommy, in a dismal tone. "No, there are not. Now listen to me. Tommy, little people can do only little things. When they are idle and mischievous, they are called boggarts, and they are a burden to the house they live in. When they are thoughtful and useful, they are brownies, and are a blessing to everyone." "I'll be a brownie," said Tommy. "I won't be a boggart. Now I'll go home and tell Johnny." "I'll take you home," said the owl, and in a moment Tommy found himself in bed, with Johnny sleeping by his side. "How quickly we came," said Tommy to himself. "But is it morning?" "That is very strange. I thought the moon was shining. Come, Johnny, get up. I have a story to tell you." Part 3. While his brother was rubbing his eyes, Tommy told him of his visit to the old owl in the grove. "Is that all true?" asked Johnny. "It is all just as I tell you, and if we don't want to be boggarts, we must get up and go to work." "I won't be a boggart," said Johnny. And so the two brownies crept softly down the ladder into the kitchen. "I will light the fire," said Tommy, "and you, Johnny, can dig some potatoes to roast for breakfast." They swept the room and laid the table. Just as they were putting the potatoes in a dish, they heard footsteps. "There's father," said Tommy. "We must run." The poor tailor came wearily down the stairs. Morning after morning he had found an untidy room and an empty table. But now, when he entered the kitchen, he looked around in great surprise. He put his hand out to the fire to see if it was really warm. He touched the potatoes and looked at the neat room. Then he shouted, "Mother, mother! Boys, boys! The brownie has come!" There was great excitement in the small house, but the boys said nothing. All day the tailor talked about the brownie. "I have often heard of little people," he said, "but this is wonderful. To come and do the work for a pan of cold water, who would have believed it?" The boys said nothing until they were both in bed. Then Tommy said, "The old owl was right, and we must stick to the work if we don't want to be boggarts. But I don't like to have father thinking that we are still idle. I wish he knew that we are the brownies." "So do I," said Johnny. Day after day went by, and still the boys rose early, and each day they found more and more to do. The brownies were the joy of the tailor's life. One day a message came for the tailor to go to a farmhouse several miles away. The farmer gave him an order for a suit of clothes and paid him at once. Full of joy at his good fortune, he hurried home. As he came near the house, he saw that the garden had been weeded. "It's that brownie," he said, "and I shall make a suit of clothes for him." "If you make clothes for the brownie, he will leave the house," said the grandmother. "Not if the clothes are a good fit, mother. I shall measure them by Tommy, for they say the brownies are about his size." At last a fine new suit with brass buttons was finished and laid out for the brownie. "Don't the clothes look fine?" said Tommy, when he came down in the morning. "I'll try them on." The tailor rose earlier than usual that day, for he wished to catch a glimpse of the brownies. He went softly downstairs. There was Johnny sweeping the floor, and Tommy trying on the new suit. "What does this mean?" shouted the father. "It's the brownies," said the boys. "This is no joke," cried the tailor angrily. "Where are the real brownies, I say?" "We are the only brownies, father," said Tommy. "I can't understand this. Who has been sweeping the kitchen lately, I should like to know?" "We have," said the boys. "Who gets breakfast and puts things in order?" "We do," they shouted. "But when do you do it?" "Early in the morning, before you come down." "But if you do the work, where is the brownie?" "Here," cried the boys. "We are the brownies, and we are sorry that we were boggarts so long." The father was delighted to find how helpful his boys had become. The grandmother, however, could hardly believe that a real brownie had not been in the house. But as she sat in her chair day after day, watching the boys at their work, she often repeated her favorite saying, "Children are a blessing." End of The Brownies, narrated by Deborah Knight, December 9th, 2013. Section 10 of Grandma Knight's Tales, This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Three Bears. Little Goldilocks was a pretty girl who lived once upon a time in a far-off country. One day she was sitting on the hearth-rug playing with her two kittens, and you would have thought she was as happy as a queen, and quite contented to stay where she was, instead of wanting to run about the world meddling with other people's property. But it happened that she was a rather mischievous little maid, and could not resist teasing her pets, so one of them scratched her, and then she would play with them no longer. She got up and trotted away into the wood behind her mother's house, and it was such a warm, pleasant day that she wandered on and on until she came into a part of the wood where she had never been before. Now, in this wood there lived a family of 3 bears. The first was a great big bear. The second was a middling-sized bear. And the third was a little teeny tiny bear. And they all lived together in a funny little house, and very happy they were. Goldilocks stopped when she came to the bear's house, and began to wonder who lived there. "I'll just look in and see," she said, and so she did. But there was no one there, for the bears had all gone out for a morning walk, whilst the soup they were going to have for dinner cooled upon the table. Goldilocks was rather hungry after her walk, and the soup smelt so good that she began to wish the people of the house would come home and invite her to have some. But although she looked everywhere, under the table and into the cupboards, she could find no one, and at last she could resist no longer, but made up her mind to take just a little sip to see how the soup tasted. The soup had been put into 3 bowls, a great big bowl for the great big bear, a middling-sized bowl for the middling-sized bear, and a teeny tiny bowl for the teeny tiny bear. Beside each bowl lay a spoon, and Goldilocks took one and helped herself to a spoonful of soup from the great big bowl. Ugh! How it burnt her mouth! It was so hot with pepper that she did not like it at all. Still, she was very hungry, so she thought she would try again. This time she took a sip of the middling-sized bear's soup, but she liked that no better, for it was too salt. But when she tasted the teeny tiny bear's soup, it was just as she liked it, so she ate it up every drop, without thinking twice about it. When she had finished her dinner, she noticed 3 chairs standing by the wall. One was a great big chair, and she climbed upon that and sat down. Oh dear, how hard it was! She was sure she could not sit there for long, so she climbed up on the next, which was only a middling-sized chair, but that was too soft for her taste, so she went on to the last, which was a teeny tiny chair, and suited her exactly. It was so comfortable that she sat on and on until, if you'll believe it, she actually set the bottom out. Then, of course, she was comfortable no longer, so she got up and began to wonder what she should do next. There was a staircase in the bears' house, and Goldilocks thought she would go up it and see where it led to. So up she went, and when she reached the top, she laughed outright, for the bears' bedroom was the funniest she had ever seen. In the middle of the room stood a great big bed. On one side of it there was a middling-sized bed, and on the other side there was a teeny tiny bed. Goldilocks was sleepy, so she thought she would lie down and have a little nap. First she got up on the great big bed, but it was just as hard as the great big chair had been. So she jumped off and tried the middling-sized bed, but it was so soft that she sank right down into the feather cushions and was nearly smothered. "I will try the teeny tiny bed," she said. And so she did, and it was so comfortable that she soon fell fast asleep. Whilst she lay there, dreaming of all sorts of pleasant things, the three bears came home from their walk very hungry and quite ready for their dinners. But, oh, dear me! How cross the great big bear looked when he saw his spoon had been used and thrown under the table. "Who has been tasting my soup?" he cried in a great big voice. "And who has been tasting mine?" cried the middling-sized bear in a middling-sized voice.
"But who has been tasting mine and tasted it all up?"
cried the poor little teeny-tiny bear in a teeny-tiny voice, with the tears running down his teeny-tiny face. When the great big bear went to sit down in his great big chair, he cried out in his great big voice, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" And the middling-sized bear cried in a middling-sized voice, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" But the teeny-tiny bear cried out in a teeny-tiny voice of anger,
"Who has been sitting on my chair and set the bottom out?"
By this time the bears were sure that someone had been in their house quite lately, so they looked about to see if someone were not there still. There was certainly no one downstairs, so they went up the staircase to their bedroom. As soon as the great big bear looked at his bed, he cried out in his great big voice, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the middling-sized bear, seeing that the coverlet was all rumpled, cried out in a middling-sized voice, "Who has been lying on my bed?" But the teeny-tiny bear cried out in a teeny-tiny voice of astonishment,
"Who has been lying on my bed and lies there still?"
Now, when the great big bear began to speak, Goldilocks dreamt that there was a bee buzzing in the room, and when the middling-sized bear began to speak, she dreamt that it was flying out of the window. But when the teeny-tiny bear began to speak, she dreamt that the bee had come back and stung her on the ear, and up she jumped. Oh, how frightened she was when she saw the three bears standing beside her! She hopped out of bed and in a second was out through the open window. Never stopping to wonder if the fall had hurt her, she got up and ran and ran and ran until she could go no farther, always thinking that the bears were close behind her. And when at length she fell down in a heap on the ground, because she was too tired to run any more, it was her own mother who picked her up, because in her fright she had run straight home without knowing it. End of The Three Bears, and end of Grandma Knight's Tales. Recordings by Deborah Knight in the year 2013.